Today we're following the Eurovelo 1 route from Cahersiveen to Glenbeigh. It's about 50 kilometres this stretch of it, and it mostly keeps you off the busy national road. So our first landmark of note on this is as we leave Cahersiveen, there's this curious building here, and when you see buildings that don't quite fit the architecture in Ireland, it's very often the case of the British military installations. In this case, it's a RIC barracks built in 1870. So why did Cahersiveen need such a big RIC barracks? There's two reasons. One is the under-Atlantic cables that were coming ashore here were obviously massively important, massive strategic value, so they wanted to protect those. But the second reason, and the reason they needed protection, was this area in February of 1867 saw a Fenian uprising. It happened here because they didn't get word that it had been cancelled elsewhere. And about 30 men gathered in Cahersiveen and they marched up to Kells, which we're heading towards now. An interesting aspect is they were led by Irishmen who had served in the Union Army during the American Civil War, and this was the Fenian strategy at the time, to recruit men who had been officers in either the Union or Confederate Army, bring them back to Ireland and use them to organise a military rising around. There were two Fenian strategies. The other one is even more interesting, which is basically they formed an army of about 5,000 and they invaded Canada from the northeastern United States on 3 different occasions, hoping to provoke a war between America and Canada. But here, I'm about to make a U-turn, and the reason is quite interesting, because is this in fact the right Eurovelo 1 route at all? There, I spotted that my map was different from the sign and went back, and here I'm going to explain it.
I'd gone about 300 metres up that way when I spotted a laneway and stopped for a toilet break, and then just happened to check my map and it told me I was gone off the Eurovelo route. However, I came back to have a look at the signposts and I thought maybe kids had loosened the sign and twisted it around, but it's not loose and it does appear to be pointing that way, but my cycle travel map shows me taking that road. And I seem to remember cycling, I wasn't necessarily following the Eurovelo, but I seem to remember following that road a few years back. Looking up this way, it seems a very roundabout way, but it would connect through again, but there doesn't seem to be any particular advantage to it. So if you're cycling this, just note that could be misleading. It could also be that they're putting in a cycleway, and maybe that's going to connect to the cycleway, but as far as I know, the cycleway's not done yet. But maybe check with that on the map as well. So it could be that that's a new route and it's going to connect through, or even it's connected through already and I don't know. I don't think that's the case, but just keep an eye out for that one.
If you're a regular follower of the channel, you'll know in a couple of places I have found where Eurovelo signposts have been moved. So that's one possibility. The other possibilities are the maps I have here. So this red line basically is where I think the diversion might go. 2 possibilities. The longer one would involve using rough forest tracks, I think, but it's impossible that's where the new cycleway that is running through this area is going. If you actually know for sure what's going on with this, you could leave a comment perhaps, and then if you're watching this, check the comments just in case anybody's able to give a more definite answer. The second possibility is that it follows the Kerry Way route, which is a walking route through Kerry. However, I did research that routed route and I think that's less likely, because although while some of it is following old butter roads and is probably rough but passable on a bicycle, I think other bits is actually crossing fields. So returning to our Fenians, as I said, they marched up to Kells Bay, which we're just approaching here, met up with another 40 or so, and here they raided the Coast Guard stations in order to seize arms that were probably stored there. Kells Bay is well worth the diversion as you pass it. Here I'm going to shoot by, but I've visited it on a previous trip. There's an absolutely beautiful little beach down there that you could pop down and go for a swim, particularly if you're there on a warm day. There's also gardens that I think include a coffee shop. Haven't visited those, but they're also very much meant to be worth visiting. We are now on our way up to Mountain Stage. Curious name, I always wondered where that came from, but that actually comes because there used to be a railway line that was coming down here, and one of the stops on that railway line was called Mountain Stage. Mountain Stage was also where, during that Fenian Rising, as they marched up towards the Killarney, they looked across to Dingle on the other side there. They expected to see fires indicating the rising had happened there, but nothing was happening, and they realised that in fact they were probably rising on their own. You may have noticed I had two mountains labelled there. One is Knocknobar, just north of Cahersiveen, and the other is Drung Hill, which you can see from the railway viaduct. The reasons I've labelled those is they are both lunacy mountains, i.e. mountains where, until relatively recently, there would have been an annual pilgrimage isn't quite the right word, but people basically would have ascended to the tops of them in late July or early August, and those ceremonies seem to stretch right back to the Bronze Age and possibly to the Neolithic in Ireland in some locations. There were multiple lunacy mountains around the island. The most famous one where there is still a remaining ceremony is Croagh Patrick, where of course people still go up the reek. They became Christianized over time, and that is true of Knocknobar, which has the Stations of the Cross now on the way up to the summit, and interestingly that's also true of Bandon as we get over towards Dingle, and presumably exactly the same story there. You've seen two remnants of the rail line there, the bridge and the aqueduct. The rail line was of course a target during the War of Independence, and particularly there was a big arms raid up at Glenbeigh. And that raid, in fact, involved the IRA sailing over from the other side, so from Dingle, which we're looking across here, and then raiding the train station at Glenbeigh, where there was a regular arms shipment. This area also saw a lot of brutal activity during the Civil War in Ireland, which followed the War of Independence or the Tan War. And there's a monument as you're coming out of Glenbeigh to one of the IRA captains who was executed by the Free State Army in that period. And the executions in this area were actually being done by members of what was called the Squad, who were Michael Collins's counterintelligence people, who were by this stage were known as the Dublin Squad. They came down to Kerry to put down the anti-treaty side and were very brutal in doing so. There were a couple of infamous incidents where they tied people to landmines and blew them up. And this brings us back to our story as to how come a bridge down at Portmagee got named after an IRA captain executed in 1942. Presumably that's because of the strength of feeling coming out of the brutal suppression of the anti-treaty side during the Civil War. If you're wondering, the railway line closed in 1960. It was one of those that perhaps was never all that economic to begin with, but couldn't compete with road traffic. So here you might want to do a quick diversion where this camper van is reversing. There's this spectacular road that runs down to Rossbeigh Beach. I was kind of tired and I wanted to stay on the Eurovelo route, so this goes the other way around that hill and down by Faha Woods, almost to Glenbeigh itself in fact, and then the Eurovelo route will turn off and go through Glenbeigh, and I'll take you on that towards the end of this video, but we're going to turn as we get to the end of Faha Woods and going to Rossbeigh Beach because that's where I actually camped for the night. Rossbeigh Beach is across from Inch Beach, and they're both these really long sandbars that stretch way out, giving you these long, I think they're both about 2 kilometers long beaches that almost touch in the middle, but the river keeps them clear. So here is the approach to it. I've been here on quite a number of occasions at this stage. It's always spectacular. In particular, you get fantastic sunsets. That's the Dingle Peninsula on the other side right ahead of us. That we're looking across to Dingle, though, is way down there on the left. And yeah, always a spectacular view, often quite rough in terms of waves, but people do swim here a fair bit, and a couple of times I've met an awful lot of jellyfish. But in any case, I was setting in for what was going to be a very fine sunset and getting myself a bit of a meal together for the night, which I'm actually going to tell you about in detail. So I thought it might be interesting to show you what I typically live off when I'm cycle touring, while camping, and I'm reasonably sure the weather's going to be warm, so I don't feel I need warm food. I don't need to cook. Staple ginger tuna, which is going into a tortilla wrap, which is basically a way of getting a lot of protein and then carbs in the wrap. Into that we have some sort of mayonnaise type sauce. In this case it's a piri mild sauce that they had on offer at Aldi in plastic bottles. These generally keep a few days out of the fridge. And to mix it up, because I'm not a cheapskate, I spent a lot of money on a fish platter at lunch, I think €34 in fact, and I took a couple of tartar sauces with me when I left.
That was down in Port McGee. It was absolutely excellent, actually. I mean, despite that price, it was very good value. Huge range of things. Lots of prawns, crab legs. I think some monkfish, squid, some battered fish, smoked salmon. There was a lot in it. I'm reciting all these because it adds to the flavour of my fine dish that I cooked tonight. Then we put our rubbish, by the way, into a little sandwich bag as we do it, leave no trace. And then a couple of tomatoes, because that's obviously going to be much healthier. It's vegetables. I find the trick with tomatoes is to stab them a few times. And then they crush down easily enough into it. You don't get that biting into them and spurting everywhere effect. I'll spread all that out a bit before I put the tomatoes in. Roll up the wrap. Fold the ends. Get the fork. Tasty. And don't forget to accompany with the bottle of wine. So, there you go. Andrew's on the road cutting 20 seconds. I think that was 2 minutes.
You'll also see people paragliding off that hill at the back of Rossbeigh. So anyway, back to the junction and up to Glenbeigh itself. And tomorrow I'm going to be taking you from Glenbeigh all the way around via Cologan to reach Inch Beach on the opposite side.